A lot of conservatives in particular would say that the rise in Islamophobia is a result not of hate, but of fear, a legitimate fear, they say, of quote-unquote jihadist terrorism, whether it's Fort Hood or San Bernardino or the recent truck attack in New York. What do you say to them?
I would say our country should be more fearful of white men across our country, because they are actually causing most of the deaths within this country.
I mean, we haven't even gotten to the really ugly data. This is just touching on it a little bit. The stuff that I'm about to discuss goes way deeper and is way more tragic. And this is what is often hidden from the Black community. Based on victims' perception of the offenders to population ratio shows that the percentage of violent incidents involving Black offenders was 2.1 times the percentage of Black persons in the population. The percentage of violent incidents involving white offenders, 50%, was about 4/5, not even 1% times the percentage of whites in the population, 62%. While the percentage of violent incidents involving Hispanic offenders, 90%, was similar to the percentage of Hispanics in the population, 17%, the percentage of violent incidents involving Asian offenders, 1%, was about 1/5 or like 0.2 times the percentage of Asians in the population. The offender to victim ratio shows that the percentage of violent incidents involving Black offenders, 25%, was over twice, 2.3 times the percentage of incidents committed against Black victims, 11%.
Now, let me try to explain that first paragraph in kind of a layman's term so people can understand what it's saying.
Right.
All it's saying is white people, in terms of violent crime, are underrepresented in committing violent crime. So they're 62% of the population, but they only account for 50% of violent crime.
Whereas Blacks
are 12% of the population, but yet we commit 25% of the violent crime. And so we're overly represented to our population. Hispanics are about even to their population, and Asians were less than their population,
right,
in terms of the percentage of violent crime. That's really what it's saying.
This isn't the FBI just saying these are these numbers or a bunch of cops. This information is gathered from the National Crime Victim Witness Survey. Victims and witnesses are giving their testimony, giving their information, and this is where this data is being collected.
That's how I tell you what, let's go ahead and get to the deeper stuff, right? Okay. Because we've been going for a minute. So let's go ahead, let's get to this deeper stuff and let's see the ugly. I will say there's been a image going around on Twitter, as a meme, and it shows the interracial violence stats in a bar graph. And one thing that is obvious on the bar graph is that the lowest category is white on Black crime. And yet in the meme, there's a television camera that is zoomed in only on the white on Black category.
Yes.
And it's representative of what the news does. And so when the media focuses on that particular category, on those particular news stories, they give a false perception that is the largest category, or that's what's happening all the time.
Right.
If you zoom out and look at all the categories, you will realize that white on Black crime is actually the lowest of all of the interracial categories in crime.
Yeah, it's like it's not even close.
Yeah. So I just wanted to talk about that before we got into your chart, because I think your chart's probably going to represent some of the same type of data.
Based on victims' percentage, about 1.7 million violent incidents in 2019 were committed against white persons by offenders who were white. 346,260 violent incidents were committed against Black persons by offenders who were Black. And 334,600 violent incidents were committed against Hispanic persons by offenders who were Hispanic. There were 5.3 times, listen, y'all, there were 5.3 times as many violent incidents committed by Black offenders against white victims, 472,570, as were committed by white offenders against Black victims, 89,980.
Yeah. So let's pause there.
We got to.
So we know there are way more white people in the country than Black people.
Right.
So you would think that there would be more crimes of white people against black people.
If common sense, especially
You would think that, and we were just saying all things are equal. But what we're seeing is the opposite. There are over 470,000 incidents of violent acts of blacks against whites, and yet only 89,000 incidents of whites against blacks.
Right.
But what does the media focus on? It focuses on one category, right? And that is white violence against blacks. And it gives the perception that that is what is happening more than not. And that black people, like LeBron James said, black people were being hunted down in the streets and all of this, when the reality is there's almost 4 times as many incidents of black people committing violent acts against white people. And we're only 12% of the population.
And it gets even worse than that. When you look at the vast majority of individuals committing the violent acts aren't young women. I mean, some.
No, it's
predominantly young men out there. So it's even smaller percentage of the population. And we know this ain't the majority of black folks. We know that. I mean, none of us are sitting over here saying that all black people are bad. And no, but there isn't. As long as we continue to ignore the problem, it will only get worse, because it's like a little kid who does wrong. And if you let them get away with it and you never correct them, they only get worse.
This is what I like to explain to people. We know violence is committed by a very small minority in any community, right?
Absolutely.
But when you have the black community, you have black culture, there's a subculture that we call street culture. And that subculture, it is what is responsible for the overrepresentation of black people in these categories.
No doubt.
Right? It is a certain culture that has a violent element to it that doesn't respect life, doesn't respect property, doesn't respect laws. And it kind of lives by its own codes of the street, per se. That subculture is what we're talking about.
No doubt.
That is the culture that needs to be addressed. And that culture is represented largely through rap music, right? So the culture that you see in rap music that's being presented, that is not predominant black culture. That is a subculture of the black community. And then I think that's what people need to understand and realize. And so, no, this isn't, because they would say, oh, this is a racist dog whistle, right? Mm-hmm. That we're saying this because you're not supposed to say this, even though it's true. You're not supposed to say it, because they have this insecurity that you're going to make racist. You're going to validate the claims of the white supremacists and the racists that say black people are just violent. But that's not what we're saying. This is a very small percentage of the community that isn't even representative of what I would consider the broader black culture. And so just to lay that out there. But to your point, and the numbers that you brought, and I've seen these numbers as well, it is about narratives. And when people allow the media narratives, we need to realize the media narrative is there to drive our emotions, to get us to behave and act in a certain way. And that is typically to get us to vote in a certain way. Mm-hmm. Right. That is why, that's why Monique started this thing off saying, hey, we know election season's coming up. You're going to be hearing some of these things. Right. And so I just wanted to be clear on what it is we're saying and what it is we're not saying, because we can have these discussions without making people believe that this is somehow indicative of the black community in general, or if you see a black person, you need to be concerned or scared. No, that's not what it is. This is a criminal element, a violent element of the black culture, a subculture that kind of goes unchecked. And nobody calls it out. And I think we'd be better off if we can get people, particularly true black leaders, to step up and really call it out.
Yeah, and we look at, and again, like back to the one of my points I was making is when we look at the black culture in general, because when we look at the high single parent home rate, when we look at the increased secularization of our society in general, it's becoming more and more popular, the black atheists. Yes. And when we're looking at the impact that has those two factors. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the impact of the sexual revolution, how that still plays such a major role in our society. You know, we may not be running around preaching free love, but that's how people are acting. Basically, lay up with somebody. Back in the day, man, when I worked in the county jail, we would take inmates to court, and man, dudes would come in there and they would have their baby mama come up there and represent them or something like that in court. And the guy would stand up and he would, maybe a domestic violence case, whatever it was. He's like, yeah, my son's mom is here to, you know, be a character witness. And the judge would be like, oh, what's her real name? And the dude said, I don't know.
Wow.
Man, I'm sitting up there. I just was like, I just put my head down. And when we got out in the hallway, I said, man, you know, I said, that's just embarrassing. I said, but that demonstrates, again, this certain subculture within a small percentage of the Black community that thinks it's cool to lay up and just run the streets and not be responsible. Have multiple babies with multiple mamas out there on the streets, and then these kids are raised without no true parenting, without their father figure in the home.
And it's a cycle.
And it's a continual cycle. And mom typically, in a lot of situations, the mom may feel guilty that the dad ain't there. So she kind of lets the kid do a little of the things that he wants to do.
Yep.
And you got a kid out there ripping and running, doing whatever he wants to do. Gangs become more and more popular. And a lot of time the gang acts as a father figure type role. It
100%.
takes that role. And as long as we can reference these issues, and this is why I say that the Democratic policies, they give the air of compassion, but in the long run, they're deadly. They kill Black folks. Black people are the major ones who fill the graves of Democratic policies.
Yeah. Look, I'm going to give an example. I don't know if you saw the video of the kid on the school bus that got on to assassinate the other kid.
Yeah.
And the gun jammed. So he ended up walking off. That kid was 14 years old. And he went on a school bus to assassinate another 14-year-old.
Right.
And they arrested 3 kids total.
It was a hit squad style attack on a Prince George's County school bus caught on video. A boy with a gun tries to shoot and kill a 14-year-old while 2 accomplices hold the victim down. Had the gun not jammed repeatedly, the victim would surely have died, investigators have said in court. And today in a Prince George's County courtroom, we learned the attack was allegedly orchestrated by an 8th grade girl who's accused of texting the attackers before they rushed the bus to let them know the victim was seated and the last rider left. The 14-year-old girl was arrested over the weekend and charged as an adult with attempted murder. Tense bailiffs in the courtroom watched to keep family members separated. The suspect's family begged for the girl to be released into home detention before trial. But arguments by attorneys revealed there are allegations of gang ties. And the victim's mother begged the judge not to let the girl go home, saying her family and the school bus driver would be terrorized that the girl could orchestrate another attack.
Only that type of stuff happens in that context.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And that's what it is, a culture that is just lost and that is just depraved. And it just doesn't respect life. Those kids were raised in a way to where that is normal behavior to them. Mm-hmm. Right. And that is what we need to address. We want to address issues within the nation in terms of the Black community and what's going on with them. That is where we have to start. And that's what I want us to start focusing on, and not getting so distracted by what the media is trying to get us to look at, which isn't even the major problem when it comes to crime, when it comes to violence. It's not even close. We've talked about a lot of issues. What we like to kind of leave on some type of advice, or how do we move forward? Like, so from your perspective, what advice would you give people who are listening to this on how to move forward when these conversations come up or these news reports come up? Is there something you want them to like listen out for or look for, or what?
The video, when we were going through the video and I pointed out how there was a lot of deflecting going on, that's the one thing to pay attention to. Pay attention to just how the narrative is often shifted. and blame is often shifted instead. And there's almost no looking in the mirror. So just be careful of that when you're having these conversations. I would suggest that the individual, regardless of what your what ethnic group you belong to, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, whatever it may be, don't be afraid to address these issues. Mm-hmm. Don't be afraid to bring up this data and share it and talk about it and have honest, open conversations. And don't expect to be able to solve the world's issues on social media. Have conversations. If it's a friend you're talking to, go out and have some coffee or sit down and talk to them. And always remember that these are always, when at the heart of it all, these are gospel issues.
Absolutely.
And when you look at the heart of man and know how we have a tendency to fall into sin and we naturally want to move away from the things of God, understand that if we can frame this conversation biblically, we can address these issues. And if you have someone who's on the other side of the conversation and they don't want to hear anything you have to say, sometimes you just have to let the conversation go. But don't be afraid. I say this over and over again, especially to our white brothers and sisters out there who oftentimes are afraid to talk about these issues because they're concerned about being called a racist. Even black folks who don't want to be called Uncle Tom, sellouts, whatever. Yeah. I get all that, man. I hear all that stuff. But I continue to talk. If we truly have compassion and love for one another, love for our brothers and sisters, then we will address these issues because we know people are dying, lives are being lost. And as long as we continue to ignore them, the problem will continue.